Good evening. This is, again, the programme about books, and all that happens is just that an extract from a book is read out by Richard Herndl or by John Moffat, and then the people sitting here try and discover who wrote that particular piece. These people are Bernardine Bishop, the novelist.
Good evening.
Anthony Blonde, publisher.
Good evening.
Anthony Burgess, the novelist.
Good evening.
And John Gross, who's a fellow of King's College, Cambridge.
Good evening.
And the first extract then is read by Richard Herndl.
Can you say what I say? I'll say anything as you say, sir, for I know it's good. Our Father. Our Father. Yes, that's very good, sir. Which art in heaven. Art in heaven. Is the light a-coming, sir? It is close at hand. Hallowed be thy name. Hallowed be thy... The light is come upon the dark benighted way. Dead. Dead, your majesty, dead, my lords and gentlemen, dead right reverends and wrong reverends of every order, dead men and women born with heavenly compassion in your hearts, and dying thus around us every day.
Splendid. Bernardine Bishop.
Dickens, Bleak House.
Right for you.
Yes. Death of Little Tom, I would say, isn't it?
Joe.
Joe. Joe, that's right.
You're thinking of Death of Little Nell, perhaps?
No, I'm thinking of Death of Little Joe, of Tom
Yes,
All
quite.
Alone. That's
Of
where he
Tom
comes
All Alone,
from.
yes.
Yes.
Would you have got that, Anthony Blonde?
No.
Not within
I
a million
wouldn't.
miles?
Within a million miles, yes. I
Who,
wouldn't
for
have got
instance,
it.
did you think? Just for fun?
I thought there was one echo, forgive me, the first opening thing, I thought it was a comic episode for the first 3 lines of Shakespeare.
Well, it's
That's
good
a
to
million
know.
miles, isn't it?
Anthony Burgess, did you recognise it?
Yes, I got that it was Dickens, but I didn't know which book. I was going to say A Tale of Two Cities first, but that seemed wrong. Possibly Bleak House was written about that time, was it? The tone seems similar. I don't know. But there's an intensity about it which is at the same time relieved by a deliberate exaggeration, which is comic in a special way. It is, I think, purely Dickensian. Of course, it could be imitated, but one might even say, no, not Wells. I thought of Kipling, The Light That Failed, or something like that. But Dickens, definitely Dickens.
John Gross.
Oh, I think unmistakably Dickens, and one would have to be, almost as good as Dickens to imitate it. In a way, I'm a bit cross because this is not typical Dickens, or rather, it's typical of one side of him. I don't think it's typical of the really great Dickens.
Perhaps that's why we put it in.
But, well, provided one's not going to laugh at it, as people do at Little Nell and so forth, it's a very powerful piece of rhetoric, I think. And he particularly, I think, had a propaganda purpose in mind when he's writing Bleak House. He got very interested in public health, attempts to control cholera and so forth. In general, he didn't believe very much in government or government interference, but he certainly did in this novel. And as I say, I think if you detach it from its context, it looks like one of his more religious deathbed scenes. But if you think of it in the whole novel, it's part of a really very admirable campaign for proper public health, proper control of
Now, that
disease.
really interests me, because I would never have thought that Dickens was what you might call interested in these social problems which he pretends to... Could I just say this? Which he pretends to be interested in. The debtors' prisons, and in his own case, the blacking factory. It's more, it seems to me, the strength of these preoccupations is the strength that might arise from a child's nightmare, rather than from a sociological document.
Well, for him, of course, the blacking shop and the debtors' prison were a child's nightmare, literally.
as well
I
as
think
everything
that
else, yes.
this extract from Bleak House is a bit untypical. He has got a real disinterested campaign about a social evil here, which he doesn't usually.
Yeah, but it doesn't sound like that, does it? Does it,
I'm
Bernardine
surprised,
Bishop?
I'm surprised that you say that it's untypical Dickens. I should have thought it was very typical indeed. I mean, you have the embarrassing deathbed scene, if you like, embarrassing. But on the other hand, the feeling behind it is so strong that I would have thought he rarely carries it off.
Now, could I say this? It's a particular aspect of Dickens's genius, what one might call the thespian or the dramatic aspect in the sense of the stage. I mean, Dickens was an actor, possibly a good actor. And but possibly Tale of Two Cities came into my mind because he got the idea of that, did he not, from a play originally, a play in which a man sacrificed himself for the woman he loved.
The Frozen Deep.
The Frozen Deep, that was the one. Wilkie Collins and he put it
Yes.
on, something like that. And there was the sense of the audience, the rhetoric, and then the sudden appeal to a court, to an
Yes,
audience.
but Tale of Two Cities isn't polemical like Bleak House, is it?
Well, the first chapter is, I would say. You know, it was the best of times, the worst of times.
He
It
was
also
very
actually
interested
somewhat.
in
Yes,
questions
of
of the day, and I mean, he was definitely involved and completely compassionate. One of his novels is about delays in chancery, is it not?
It's not about that at
Well,
all.
I mean, this is touched on, and for instance, the one thing which is rather moving, I think, when he wrote about that school, you know, Wackford Squares and all that, he
Yeah.
went to Yorkshire and
Didn't
went
make
round
the-
these terrible schools.
I really must
mean,
take up an argument with you here. Perhaps it's not the chairman's function, but I can't help it. He thinks he's interested in these things.
Well,
He's-
why bother to trundle up on that clumsy post-chaise, which
people
we
have
know
done,
he did?
People have done stupider things than that, or, you know, and then written a book which they could have written out of their heads. He wrote it out of his head and his experience. And I think he only thought he was a
It's
social.
not, that's
he wrote
partly
out of his
true.
heart.
He did feel these things strongly, but he didn't really believe in social reform. He believed in the exercise of individual philanthropy. But if he'd thought about it at all, surely he would have come to him that individual philanthropy could do very little about the Yorkshire schools and about the debtors' business.
Right.
And so on.
Well, at the risk of being pedantic on this one, I do think Bleak House is a bit different. Dickens was very much opposed to busybodies. He was against the idea, perhaps, of government interference. But at this time, when he wrote Bleak House, this is perhaps a big anomaly in his career, he became very interested in the public boards of health which are being set up. They're being set up, this is a curious thing, by Edwin Chadwick, who was also the man who'd been more than anyone else responsible for the poorhouses, the workhouses that Dickens was getting at, in Oliver Twist, of course. In general, the kind of man that Dickens was most opposed to. But this was a period in his life when he did plunge in to genuine social reform, and this is one reason it's untypical. Of course, in a way, the kind of great and absolutely irresistible waves of self-pity that come through this passage are typical, one must
I
admit.
wonder, could I just ask you this, to turn off the sociological tack a little? Do you regard the feeling in this as sentiment or sentimentality?
I don't think you can use either term properly. It is a kind of cold rhetoric. It's a kind of, it is essentially an actor's pose. The actor knows perfectly well what he's doing, and he's trying to gauge the effect of his words on his audience. He's aware of his audience, he's aware of himself uttering these words. And I don't think the content matters all that much. It's the force of emotion. Feeling about the things in question doesn't really come into it.
But is it equal to the object to which it's directed, or is it in excess of it? I mean, is it sentimental, or is it equal?
It can't be an excess. The emotion can't be an excess.
It's not an excess. It's not quite genuine. It's a bit operatic because, for example, Dickens wasn't a very religious man, and he nevertheless plays on the full organ pipes of religion at his deathbed scenes. If I got a bit cross, and if I said it was untypical, it's more that I've heard Dickens laughed at so many times when this kind of passage is torn out of context. If one's looked at the character of Joe in the rest of the novel, if one has seen Chadband browbeating him, has this brother Taruth, he has not Taruth, and so forth. It's a kind of cumulative thing. I think it's much more powerful coming at the end there than it is. It sounds more sentimental, I think.
I
out of
must say,
context.
I ask because my own feeling is that it's full of sentiment. That's to say, full of a genuine, authentic feeling,
Yes.
however operatically deployed or
Agreed.
Yes,
Absolutely.
yes, I think so, and I think we're wrong to feel embarrassed for Dickens when a passage like this comes up.
One doesn't, but I still maintain the emotion itself is not properly geared to the subject. That it is its own excuse. It's there for itself, nothing else. Dickens is the artist in one sense here, and not the social reformer.
Shall we go on and do something else? This particular piece is read by John Moffat.
My father always assumed, as I do now, that anything new was likely to be nasty. Barbara found a specific charm in modernity. She did not pursue novelty. She was no butterfly of fashion flitting from vorticism to Dadaism. She was, rather subversive by tradition, a spaniel lolloping dreamily along at her mother's heels. I argued sturdily with her, but I picked up many of her arguments, which I reproduced next term in my essays, with the result that Mr. Howitt in my report made a rebuke which I have seldom incurred in my later years. He must learn to approve those things that are excellent, not merely those that are ultra-modern.
You got it, Anthony Blonde?
I put down Nancy Mitford or Evelyn Waugh, but it's probably a man.
Ah, that was very good. I think you must have that,
Oh,
Evelyn Waugh.
thank you. It's the first one I've ever had.
Is it really? It's not frightfully important, you know,
No.
one way or t'other.
It's presumably the autobiography.
Yes.
Yes. And very readable, gentle, easy stuff. Not astonishing, I thought, in any way.
Bernadine
Did
Bishop,
you?
did you recognise it?
No, I didn't. I haven't read the autobiography and I wouldn't have got it. But I liked the passage. I mean, I knew perfectly well that I hadn't read it. It made that much impression on me. But, yes, I think one could have placed it with regard to period quite satisfactorily.
20s.
Yes.
Dadaism.
Did you get it, Anthony Burgess?
Yeah, I got it, yes, but hearing it like that, torn out of context, I was quite prepared to see it as part of some very minor novel of the late 1920s, early 1930s, and it seemed to me then to be full of the usual sort of cliches of attitude, vorticism and Dadaism, and again the usual sort of the reproof. You know, what's the final line? He must learn to love those things which are
Excellent. Those that are not
yes.
just those that are merely
But
modern.
of course, I don't think we could excuse that in a novel, but we can excuse it in an autobiography, because an autobiography is about real life, and real life needs no excuse.
Tom Gross, did you spot it?
Yes, I got it. And I think that, following on from Anthony Burgess, that the autobiography is written in a much flabbier, more kind of sitting in the club armchair style than Waugh's novels. I'd like to make the excuse for him that it's tongue-in-cheek. I think the episode it comes from is a very interesting one in the novel, and very revealing one. Barbara, if I remember correctly, is the fiancée of his brother. And the entire autobiography is really about someone who has studiously, deliberately turned his back on the modern world while knowing exactly what he's doing and really knowing all about the modern world. And Barbara is the one episode. He treats this poor girl very sardonically. He's still a schoolboy at the time. I found out then, for example, from this passage, that one of the first things he published had been A Defense of Cubism, written when he was about 14, under the influence of Barbara. And poor Barbara has to carry on her shoulders the whole burden of everything that's modern, you know, Picasso and plastics and sunbathing and socialism.
I wonder if you think that his tongue is so permanently in his cheek that it impairs the communication.
No, I think this is a perfectly straight autobiography, rather a slack piece of work. I don't think he should do another. I'm a great admirer of his style, his wit, and his storytelling. And it's quite interesting to see that none of the snobbery of which he has, in my view, been very justly accused is explained in this autobiography. I mean, Evelyn was reckoned never to have recovered from being to Lancing and Harvard College, spiteful.
Well,
circles.
he does seem to me in this particular book to have inflated his style to a point where he appears actually to be patronising the events of his own life in such a continuous way as to rob them of interest, in such a way as to neuter them.
The events of his whole life, or just the events of his
Oh,
youth?
this, I beg your pardon, just
events
this
of his
particular
youth.
section.
Yes, yes.
It's not an exciting book, is it? I mean,
I don't
let's
think,
face
well,
it.
the material is not exciting.
No.
One is rather shocked to find the lack of interest in literature, the nastiness of the young boy, the flabby, unpleasant, unspectacular sins he commits. But the whole thing is redeemed by this pastiche Gibbon style in which the book is written, of which that, of course, is not a good example. That sounds like a not very good novel.
But you remember
Serious.
Yes.
The Brideshead Revisited, which was the kind of book which all undergraduates enjoy. I remember one wild Australian coming into my room saying, I am a synthesis of all the characters, you see. And this was lovely, the way they lolled around smoking their fat and duller number 11s. None of this comes through in the autobiography.
Well, he was
He should
ashamed
have
of
had
that.
rather-
He became ashamed of that
Did he?
style. He
Yes.
rewrote
Most
Brideshead
of it
Revisited.
doesn't come through, and it's very interesting because he covers the same ground, and it comes out flat in reality, whereas it was very sparkling in the novel. Bits and pieces do. I remember in the stuff about Oxford, the description of the club called the Hooster and Protean Club, which used to live backwards, get up, dress in full evening dress, drink whiskey at 10 o'clock.
But do you
and so
remember,
forth.
do you remember whether he was able to convey this information to you straight, or did he, as it were, have to cock it at an angle, as though he were acting in a continuous cocoon of icy disdain?
Oh, yes. For the most part, I think he did. A sentence which stuck in my mind, describing this Oxford period, he says, a period in which he plunged too heavily into social life, he says, I was somewhat too promiscuous of my familiars.
Tush, tush. Upon that note, shall we move on? And the next piece is read by Richard Herndl.
He said that for general improvement, a man should read whatever his immediate inclination prompts him to. Though, to be sure, if a man has a science to learn, he must regularly and resolutely advance. He added, what we read with inclination makes a much stronger impression. If we read without inclination, half the mind is employed in fixing the attention, so there is but one half to be employed on what we read. He told us he read Fielding's Amelia through without stopping. He said, if a man begins to read in the middle of a book and feels an inclination to go on, let him not quit it to go to the beginning. He may perhaps not again feel the inclination.
Anthony Burgess.
Well, that is Boswell's Life of Dr. Samuel Johnson, Lit D, I think.
Do you take exception to the doctor's advice there?
No, I think the doctor said the final bit of advice the doctor gives is very right. I doubt if I myself have read a book through in my life.
No, he didn't say it there.
Well, he said if a man begins a book in the middle and has an inclination to go on, he should go on.
Yes.
And that leads on to the fact, of course, that Johnson read very few books through. He knew more books than anybody, so Boswell says. But he'd read very few books through.
He admitted that.
He admitted that. He used a book. He tore a book to pieces. He made it part of himself. He didn't allow himself to be enclosed by the book.
Didn't Boswell say somewhere that he had a wonderful power of tearing the heart out of a book? But it is not. I don't think it ought to be an example to all of us.
Bernardine Bishop, don't you just love that Dr. Johnson?
Well, as I listened to the passage, not being able to place it, I'm afraid, I did get the impression of rather a good educator being talked about by some keen disciple. But I don't know that this idea of just following one's inclinations. I mean, he must perhaps have had very strong inclinations about reading anyway. So
He was in a
did.
position to
I mean, I
indulge
don't
them.
think all of us would
Anthony
ever
Blom.
read at all if one followed.
Don't you think the passage was in fact rather ugly and difficult to listen to? It is very much the mark of a shorthand diarist tape recording sort of mind.
Well,
He
that is-
said,
I
the
do-
repetition of he said and the inclination.
I do hope
wasn't-
you're right, because sometimes I think Boswell invented it all.
Do you?
I mean, it's that good.
No, he must have been the most tremendously attractive and good man, Johnson. I mean, we know he suffered a lot of pain. He never really was very bad-tempered, and always in such a thunderingly complicated way that you were touched to be the object of his attention. I don't think he ever hurt anybody. But I think it's an awfully boring bit, and I don't think it's a very exciting book. I prefer the anecdotes that other people tell of Johnson.
Oh, yes, well, they're not going to give you one of those on this
No,
program.
no,
they
of
want
course
to test your
Incidentally,
expertise.
I think he was a fine old leg puller, Dr. Johnson, and I wonder how much he was kidding. He didn't like Fielding, of course, and I wonder if he'd have said the same for a novel or a novelist that he really liked. I bet he read lots of novels through from cover to cover and didn't miss a word.
Well, he must have been one of the very few men who read the whole of the Anatomy of Melancholy. He says that he used to get up early in the morning, I forget how early, 4 o'clock, 4 a.m., to start reading the Anatomy of Melancholy.
Of course, he couldn't
Because he
sleep
went
well.
through.
He was, as you remember, not
He
a man who
couldn't-
could sleep.
Couldn't get
And
up
indeed
easily,
suffered
though,
from
either.
melancholy.
No, true.
No.
Something I always wonder is how definitive were all these opinions which were so faithfully recorded by Boswell. I mean, didn't Johnson perhaps, like everybody, say one thing one day and another thing another day?
I'm sure he was pestered beyond belief, to answer academic questions by this chap who was
Yes,
always there.
surely, that's what I
They're a
always
kind
feel.
of comedy team, in a way.
Yeah. He was a very limited man in a way. Remember, he couldn't understand Bishop Berkeley's theory, and yet he had to make a sort of smart point of it. So he kicked the stone by the door and said, "Sir, we refute it
Well, that's
thus."
much more than a
Yes.
smart point, I think.
I
That
think
is
so, too.
the ordinary human reaction to it. I think he had
Pragmatist.
A very
wonderfully
colourful
human
thing
reaction.
to do.
I think having
You don't
Boswell
have-
around would push anyone into a
Yes,
position of
quite.
having to have an opinion
Yes.
about everything. Anyway.
No, but he did in general, I think, and he was a wonderfully funny man who didn't take himself in deadly earnest. He described his style of talking, remember, as talking for victory, whether it was
Yes.
Boswell or anyone else, he had to rather, not say crush people, but get the better of them. And he knew that he wasn't to be taken in deadly earnest.
And I must say, I think Boswell must have been an appealing man in his way, otherwise it wouldn't have happened. I remember the first time that Johnson, perhaps feeling a little pressed to do so, but the feeling comes out much better than that. They're sitting together, and finally Johnson says, "Give me your hand. I have taken a liking to you." And I think that's one of the most moving lines I've ever read in my life.
Oh, yes.
Well, that seems to have ground the conversation. So we go on to the next one, which I believe is read by John Moffat.
Alas, said the mouse, the world is growing smaller every day. At the beginning it was so big that I was afraid. I kept running and running, and I was glad when at last I saw walls far away to the right and left. But these long walls have narrowed so quickly that I am in the last chamber already, and there in the corner stands the trap that I must run into. You only need to change your direction, said the cat, and ate it up.
John Gross.
I'm stumped, I'm afraid. I'll take a wild guess at something like Saki.
Now then, Anthony Burgess.
Yes, indeed. It's not a translation. May I ask that question? It is a piece of English literature.
No one said it had
No,
to be a piece
no,
of English literature.
no.
I think I'll tease you along a little and not tell you.
No, quite. I would say about that period, I would say a very self-conscious imitation of Aesop or La Fontaine, written by a sophisticated man, a man with his eye on the times. Not Saki. I don't know.
Anthony Blonde, you seem to be on the verge.
No, don't know, but it couldn't be Sarkis. They're famous stories in the Toby Moore when the cat starts talking. But as far as I remember, the cat only talks to the other people in the room. It's so embarrassingly, they finally strangle it. I don't think the mouse chats away.
It's a bit more sinister than that, though, don't you think, this bit?
Is it earlier than that?
No, you're here to say. Bernardine
We
Bishop,
can't get
you
one.
know.
I conveyed absolutely nothing. Nothing at all.
No second thought. It's written by Kafka.
Oh.
Ah.
How clever of Professor Burgess, then,
Why?
to ask if it was a translation.
Yes, it was.
yes,
That's
yes,
why I
yes,
wouldn't
yes.
tell him.
Yes.
Yes.
We might
What's
then.
it from? Is it from the diaries, the notebooks? Or is it
I'm
from the
going to
novel?
turn it up and see. It's called A Little Fable.
Nasty little fable, too.
It is. It's like a spoiled
Is that the lot of it?
epigram.
Is
Does
that the whole thing? Is it that little, I mean, the fable?
I haven't the remotest
No.
notion. No idea. But do you, now you know it's Kafka, and you all said, oh yes, oh yes. Why are you saying, oh yes, oh yes?
Well, I'm not saying oh yes at all, on second thoughts. It doesn't sound like Kafka, really. Kafka can only be appreciated at some length. If you read the diaries that Max Brooke edited, the little epigrams, the little aphorisms that Kafka comes out with are not very telling, very pregnant. You have to appreciate Kafka. You can only appreciate Kafka if you get a long chunk of him with a character suffering at great length and, as in the trial, waiting perpetually for something to come of this long, this endless.
But he's talking about walls,
No,
isn't
but I would
he?
agree. There is
Yeah.
that rather short piece. I can't quite remember what it's from now, but it's about a doorkeeper. It's quite a short piece with something of the rather strongly horrifying tone of this little fable.
I thought,
He's best at length, though, isn't he?
oh, not
Yes,
at all,
I think,
as
well,
the case
if
may be.
he's going to be good at all. If he's good at all, he's good at length. He's good when he can use the peculiar rhythm, peculiar flat rhythms of his prose to lull you into a sense that all this world is real.
Is this read in the original?
Well, in English too, I think.
Hands up anyone who thinks he's a terrible bore.
No, I don't.
No, I don't.
No.
Very
You obviously
touched
do.
and moved by
No,
it.
not really. It's just flying a kite.
No.
Now, what touches and moves you about Kafka?
Well, the fear that he has of everything.
Not.
He's
Yeah.
a very frightened man. And these extraordinary long-distance love affairs, when he was sitting on a square and said to his girlfriend with whom he's been corresponding, for heaven's sake, when you do come and see me, don't cross the square. It's direct. Just come, or do cross the square so that I can see that you are you. And then, of course, at the last moment, left a note and said, I can't face it after all. I think he was the original frightened man of the 20th century, which is why he's so much quoted and so much relished and so
Left
original.
unread.
More
Yes.
to it than that. I mean,
Yes.
he's a great allegorist, isn't he? He tells the truth. The story of the trial is a true story. That's the position we're all in. It can be regarded as an allegory of original sin, if you like, but I think the castle presents allegorically and with great power the situation we're all in, the sense that we have to do a particular job, we're given orders to do it, we don't know who's giving the orders, all we know is that they're living in a castle there, God, if you like, the forces that control our lives. I feel that to be true. I feel that to present my own feeling about life, that man is not capable of running it for himself, reason doesn't help, nothing helps.
Except using the self up, possibly, instead of regarding it as is quite colourable to regard it as a prison, which he does. But if you put it to use, you can get out of it or have the illusion of getting out of it that way. Do you think so, John Gray?
Yeah, I think that this means that he's not one of the very greatest writers. I mean, King Lear shows people in just such a trap. But inside the prison cell, they are still, three-dimensional people with blood in them. In Kafka, they tend to be rather wan and ghostly before they start. This means, I think, that he's not quite as great as some of his admirers have claimed, but beyond that, I think that he does tell one great truths about the human condition. It's very interesting that one could interpret the trial in an indefinite number of ways. It's not an allegory with one meaning. It's a kind of fable, which does seem to me to correspond to whatever sense of human beings being trapped or imprisoned or frustrated one may have. I do agree with Anthony Burgess, though, that he's much better taken at length when he creates a whole world, when one feels oneself trapped in the world that he's created. Over a short distance, like this one, I thought fables without a moral, just almost a bit of wanton cruelty. One needs to get into his world to be convinced by it.
There is that in him. I think the cruelty of the long short story Metamorphosis, in which a young man is turned into a gigantic beetle, and the varied attitudes which his parents take up, pity, loathing, fear, indifference, and so forth. That seems to be both a very powerful summation of the human position, but at the same time it is wanton. It is wanton, and it is sadistic, if you like.
It's as though
there's a desire to be cruel.
Yes, it's as though he's much more interested in having someone turn into a beetle than he is in the responses that might follow.
When
Exactly.
you say cruel, don't you feel he identifies with the victim rather than with the persecutor? I mean, isn't he more masochistic than sadistic?
Yeah,
if you
masochistic
like?
better
Well,
word.
sadomasochist.
Yes.
Well,
Nice long word.
now another one. This time it's read by Richard Herndl.
Suddenly she paused, and through my fingers I saw an awful change come over her countenance. Her great eyes suddenly fixed themselves into an expression in which horror seemed to struggle with some tremendous hope, arising through the depths of her dark soul. The lovely face grew rigid, and the gracious willowy form seemed to erect itself. "Man," she half whispered, half hissed, throwing back her head like a snake about to strike. "Man, where didst thou get that scarab on thy hand? Speak, or by the spirit of life I will blast thee where thou standest."
Grand stuff, Bernardine Bishop, who wrote it.
Rider Haggard.
Yes, very good.
Well done.
Astonishingly
Yes,
clever.
very
Is
good.
it she?
Yes, it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Have you ever read it? You must have
No,
done.
oddly enough, I haven't. It
ju-
was just a guess.
There are
Putting
some books
together,
that
yes.
you know without reading, aren't there?
Putting the style together with the fact that it was obviously about a she of some.
Well, that's jolly good.
With a capital S.
Yes.
What about Anthony Blonde?
Didn't get. I'm delighted it's Rider Haggard because he's one of the most exciting. I mean, his stories are almost the most exciting I've ever read. King Solomon's Mines, for instance. You know, when the man is going to be put in a pot, and he says, "Well, supposing I tell you there's going to be a new moon or a partial eclipse, I think it is, of the sun," and he's taken out some diary that his wine merchant gave him before he left, and he's right, and he's saved. Lovely piece of invention.
Oh, I have, in fact, read She. I read it as a young boy, and I also saw the film. I have a very strong recollection of the old silent film. I remember the name of the hero, which is Ayesha, or Asher, and I also recollect that the book was the most scholarly one. It was full of Egyptian hieroglyphics. I was a young boy, as I say, when I read it, so I wasn't able to interpret the. Well, of course, I can't now either. But the thing struck me as being being rather more being rather more than an adventure story. But there's one terrible moment in the book when she leads the young blonde Nordic hero, who's destined to be her eternal consort, to the fire of eternal life. She enters the fire to renew her youth, and she turns into something subhuman. And a character called Holly, the sort of comic cockney, says, "Look, she's turning into a monkey." A wonderful moment, and the thrill is still there with me. I think it's a great book.
You read it, John Grace?
No, King Solomon's Mines, and that's as far as I go. But I think I'd have guessed it. The Scarab was a bit of a giveaway, I think.
What is a scarab?
It's a beetle.
Yes, yes.
Beetle shard.
It seemed to me tremendously of its period, as well as Rider Haggard. That kind of pagan, rather erotic, rather exotic kind of writing. Can't quite put my finger on the quality of it, but it does seem to belong with, shall we say, late Victorian academic painting, you know, Alma Tadema and that kind of thing.
You've got, in order to throw your, if you're a lady, in order to throw your head back with like a snake about to strike, you've got to have the right kind of neck, haven't you? It can't be one of our modern chunky girls. I had a feeling, funny enough, of a pre-Raphaelite painting of a long girl with a very, very long white neck, hair down to her shoulders.
You seem to
Pleasing
know,
eyes.
you know quite a lot about it, and you like it, obviously, his stuff. Any moral in it? Any attitude, any style of life betrayed by the book?
I leave that to our
Or is it-
professors on your left. I just enjoyed it as, you know, adventurous stuff.
I'm sure you're quite right. I
Yeah,
just
I don't know.
wondered.
I think it's a very simple moral, it is, and that you mustn't look for eternal life. You must learn to grow old gracefully and not ask for too much. Very simple moral.
Seems reasonable.
I
Yeah.
dimly recall, just from King Solomon's Mines, that there was quite a lot of imperialism and
yes.
white man's burden about it as well, or poor man's Kipling.
Well, look, I think we've got time for the next one, but only just. It's read by John Moffat.
On a very slowly moving band, a rack full of test tubes was entering a large metal box. Another rack full was emerging. Machinery faintly purred. It took 8 minutes for the tubes to go through, he told them. 8 minutes of hard X-rays being about as much as an egg can stand. A few died. Of the rest, the least susceptible divided into 2. Most put out 4 buds, some 8. All were returned to the incubators where the buds began to develop. Then after 2 days were suddenly chilled, and checked.
Anthony Blonde.
Chilled, and checked. 2 chills, rather.
There were.
It's very creepy piece, isn't it? 20th century.
Yes. Good lad.
No, I don't know. It's not Huxley, is it? I don't know.
Yes,
Yes.
Brave New
Now
World.
you should, you know, gamesmanship. You shouldn't have said that quite so casually. Anyway, no, that was very good. Did you spot it?
Yes, yes, indeed. In fact, it's my least favourite, I think, of Huxley's books. But
Why is that, do you think?
well, I think he gives way in it to his rather horrible mechanistic sadism, which one feels in a very slight way in most of his novels. There seems to be an absolute orgy of it in Brave New World. I find the tone objectionable, though I think the imagination is marvellous.
Anthony Bird.
I want to admire the book greatly. I think the idea is a colossal one, an idea of tremendous importance. I think it's very, philosophically, it's very, very profound. But I think it's spoiled by a good deal of inattention to detail, and it's sloppily written. I can only say that I wish I'd written it. I wish I'd had the idea.
Oh,
I wish I
yes.
knew what Huxley had known. The notion of this confrontation of a world in which a young savage is brought up solely on the works of Shakespeare, and this world in which Shakespeare and all imaginative writers are banned, and you have as a substitute a school of emotional engineering. I think this is a great conception.
But it's... Oh, do you really? Do you think so,
I think it's a
John
great
Grace?
conception.
Yes, I think it's his best book, actually. The kind of mechanical or emotionally clumsy side of him, which to me rather mars most of his novels, is here a real strength, because he, after all, is showing a world in which a kind of mechanical sadism has taken over,
Does
and
he
satirizing.
Does he succeed in showing it, or is it simply a debate which he is convincingly or not?
Oh, I think much more than that. I feel it's a smothering world. I feel stifled by it, and consequently, when the people discover, a single line of Shakespeare, one gets a wonderful kind of shiver from this, a tiny spark in the darkness.
Well, on that very positive note, I'm just going to have to tell you all to stop, because that's the end. That's all there is, and the next programme will be on Wednesday, the 9th of December. Until then, I bid you goodbye.